So, do you guys know how there is basically a conspiracy that there is one group that controls the media in the US? Well, Muslims have the same problem with Saudis and Wahhabism. What we have in Islam right now is that a small, narrow current completely monopolizes the voice of Islam. For example, if anybody was trying to learn about Islam, 90% of the stuff that they will find is going to be Wahhabi inspired narratives. So while Wahhabism does not really represent Islam, it dominates all of the Sunni Islam online platforms. The point of the video is to argue that Wahhabism is primarily a political and institutional product. It's basically an exported, state backed cultural project, and it is not an organic, uncontested majority representation of Sunni Islam. The reason why I'm making this video is that while I'm not a Muslim, I'm very much interested in Islam. And I fear that for people who are interested in religion and are looking into Islam, they will only interact with the Wahhabi interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah. So while Wahhabism does not really represent Islam, it dominates all of the Sunni Islam online platforms. So how did one current gain such outsized reach? Introduction to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was born in a village in the Najd region in Saudi Arabia. As a result, he followed the Hanbali school as it was the dominant school in that region. Most of his education in his early life was either from his father, who was a Hanbali, or from the works of Ibn Qudama, who was a Hanbali and is regarded as one of the most authoritative classical figures of the Hanbali tradition. So while many Wahhabis sometimes like to stress this part of the story to claim that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was Hanbali, he simply was not. Alright, so here I'm not interested in trying to prove that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was wrong. I'm just interested in showing the differences between himself and other Muslims. The main thing here is his use of takfir. So he had important disagreements with some Islamic practices at that time, such as saint veneration or the practice of istighatha, which is kind of basically like intercession. So he basically considered these practices to be idolatry, so basically shirk. So he declared people that practice saint veneration or istighatha as kuffars, which is the term for non-believers. So this is where he kind of separates himself from the Hanbali school, because the Hanbali school never went this far. Uh, However, Ibn Abdul Wahhab does not stop there with his use of takfir, right? So he also declares that Muslims who do not declare the Muslims who do these practices to be non-believers are also non-believers themselves. So, if you were a Muslim and disagreed with the Wahhabis on the idea that saint veneration or istighatha is not idolatry, even though you do not practice, even though you do not perform istighatha, you are still non-believer. He was obviously rejected by most of the scholars that lived in his area. This is where he decides to leave his place in search of another, where he can spread his teachings. He needed a state that will embrace his teachings so that the Wahhabi movement can spread in the Muslim world. This is where Al Saud comes to the picture. See, Al Saud had come to control a place called Diriyah, which is only like 20 miles south of where Abdul Wahhab was staying. Most importantly, most of the practices that he condemned had not spread in that area. So he thought that he will have a better opportunity there in establishing and spreading Wahhabism. Assaud, on the other hand, that time was in need of a religious authority who can give them religious justification for their political aims. So the best way to understand the pact that happens between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and Al Saud is honestly through Gramsci work and analysis of culture. See, Gramsci argues that culture is how a ruling class converts power into moral authority, which people accept as common sense. Religious intellectuals manufacture consent. The state supplies resources and institutions that anchor that cultural dominance. In this case, with the Wahhabis and Al Saud, Wahhabis basically acted as the intellectuals for the Saudis and producing doctrines, educating people, and mediating between rulers and ruled, and giving a justification for the Saudi rule over the area. So, by the time Saudi Arabia was founded in 1932, Wahhabism was the dominant religious ideology there. However, it was still very much rejected in other Arabian countries. It was not till the 1960s that Saudi Arabia began massively exporting Wahhabism. So, the reason for this was simply the Cold War. So, you see, socialism was by far the most popular ideology in the Middle East at that time. This was a problem for Western countries, and they needed another cultural ideology that can combat socialism, and that was Wahhabism. So, many Western countries obviously encouraged Saudi Arabia to export Wahhabism. Another reason that was more particular for Saudi Arabia was the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The problem is that they are not Sunni and they are Shia Muslim. So the spread of Wahhabism was to some extent also to isolate Iran from other Islamic countries, as Saudi Arabia cannot tolerate another religious authority in that region. So, another important factor that also played a part in the spread of Wahhabism among Arabian countries is that during the period when Saudi Arabia began massively exporting Wahhabism to other countries, is that Islam was not an ideological or a cultural force at that point. So, as you know, a lot of the Arabian countries began to adopt secularism and socialist ideologies. So, when Saudi Arabia began massively exporting Wahhabism, there wasn't another Muslim group that would reject them. There was no other strong representation of Islam in these countries. So, when Wahhabism basically kind of declared itself as the truthful interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, there basically wasn't any competitors.
So yeah, if you're honestly listening to Muhammad Hijab, Uthman ibn Farouk, Shamsi, Dr. Yasir Qdeh, Faris al-Hamadi, Ismail al-Hakim, Mufti Menk, and literally almost everyone, you're not actually getting a full representation of Islam. You're getting like a version of Islam that was largely inspired certain political aims. Alright, thank you for watching the video. If you like the content, please subscribe, comment, and share. Thank you. You have a good day.